You think of reef systems, you typically think of coral reefs existing today. Coral reefs make up the common types of reef building organisms today. Well, if you go back far in the distant past, corals were not the only type of reef building organisms that used to exist. There were coral reefs that used to exist over hundreds of millions of years ago, but there were a variety of different types of organisms that built reefs instead of corals. And today we are going to explore the variety of different organisms that created reef systems over time. The first ones that we typically go to when we talk about reef systems are things called stromatolites. During the Precambrian, stromatolites were some of the more common reef systems before corals. Stromatolites are actually sedimentary structures that are created by the building of cyanobacteria. Typically in the fossil record, they'll look like this. So you typically will have these lineations kind of built up to one another, and when you slice them in half, you'll see the wavy-like patterns. And that is the build-up of sediment over time, and it was actually secreted by this gooey substance that was created by the cyanobacteria. And sediment would get in between the cyanobacteria and basically would build up over time. So these particular fossils are the types of rebuilding systems that you'll commonly see in the Precambrian. And they are actually the oldest type of rebuilding organisms that you can find in the fossil record. So this is a really great example of that. There are also stromatolites like this. This stromatolite is actually the oldest known fossil. It's the oldest stromatolite I have, and it's about 2.3 to 2.1 billion years old. This comes from Australia. And then typically on the outside of a stromatolite, you'll see these concentric circles. So by looking at the fossil record, we can learn a lot about reef building organisms, including some of the very first knowns that are found in the fossil record. And when you split it in half, you can see these wavy-like patterns, and this is what we call a stromatolitic pattern. And these patterns are specifically known from stromatolites. And they can be a variety of different types of shapes and structures. But the more common type of structure is this wavy-like structure that you typically see recorded in the rock record. Now, stromatolites are not extinct. They're still living today, but they are not as common as they were in the past. They are less common today than they were in the Precambrian or in the Paleozoic. So stromatolites are still living today. But those are some of the oldest known reef systems that we have, at least in the Precambrian. Now, when we get into the Paleozoic, we enter the first period in the Paleozoic, which is called the Cambrian period. And coral reefs were very not well known in the Cambrian. There are other types of rebuilding organisms known as Archaeocyathids. Archaeocyathids are kind of still a mysterious type of organism. They are now classified as being belong to sponges. They are actually fossilized sponges. And these particular sponges secrete calcium carbonate and are actually built limestone reefs. And we can find this in Cambrian rocks. So here is an example of an Archaeocyathids fossil. This particular specimen is from the Shady Dolomite in Georgia. And Archaeocyathids are actually some of the oldest known fossils in the state of Georgia. This particular specimen dates back to the early Cambrian, around 516 million years ago. And stromatolites are some of the more common types of reef-building organisms you can find in the early Cambrian. Now, what's great about Archaeocyathids is that they're only known in the early Cambrian. So if you go into rocks that are about the Cambrian age, or at least in the earliest portion of the Cambrian, and you find these different types of fossils, specifically Archaeocyathids, that lets you know that you're in the earliest portion of the Cambrian period. These are what is known as index fossils. So Archaeocyathids are restricted into the earliest portion of the Cambrian, and they're found all over the world. So if you find an Archaeocyatid specimen within a rock, that lets you know that you're in the early portion of the Cambrian period. Here is another particular specimen. This comes from Labrador, and you see these little white specks here. These white specks or these little white circles here, are the cross sections of Archaeocyathids. And so they built these major reef systems in the earliest portion of the Cambrian. Here is another specimen. This specimen is Cambriocyathus, or Cynocyathes, I'm sorry. And this particular specimen is from Australia. And now you can actually see the cross section here of that Archaeocyathids. So you're actually looking at the top portion of that specimen, or the cross-section. And just to give you an example of what an archaeocyatid looks like, you're looking at the top portion. So what you're typically looking at when you're looking at a fossil archaeocyatid is the top portion, or the cup, of this particular Cambrian sponge that eventually would create the limestones that we see in the early portion of the Cambrian all over the world. So archaeocyathids are also known in Australia. So again, they are the index fossils for the earliest portion of the Cambrian. So if you find an archaeocyatid specimen, that lets you know that you're in the earliest portion of the Cambrian. Archaeocyathids went extinct by the mid-Cambrian period, so they make really good index fossils. As we start to travel through time and we get into the Ordovician, there were other reef-building organisms. So the archaeocyathids went extinct by the earliest or the middle Cambrian. But things like corals and sponges were quite common as well. And there were some other sponges known as Stromatoporoids. Stromatoporoids sound very similar to stromatolites, but instead of being cyanobacteria, Stromatoporoids were actually sponges. These were calcareous sponges, or sponges that had the skeleton or the body composed of calcium carbonate. And this is a Stromatoporoid. This is, I believe, from one of the Devonian deposits in Kentucky. You can see this wavy type of structure, very similar to that of a stromatolite. So don't get those two confused. Stromatolites are the sedimentary structures created by cyanobacteria. Stromatoporoids are organisms that formed by the secreted calcium carbonate. So they may sound very similar to one another, but they're completely different types of organisms. Here is another Stromatoporoid. You can see that wavy pattern. It looks very similar to that of a stromatolite, hence the name. But Stromatoporoids, again, are calcareous algae that are found in the Ordovician, or start to appear in the Ordovician, and I believe go extinct by the Devonian. There are some possibly Cretaceous or Mesozoic Stromatoporoids, but most of the diversity of Stromatoporoids start to drop by the end of the Devonian. So these were actually common reef-building organisms in the earliest Paleozoic, between the Ordovician and Devonian. So we talked a little bit about sponges. What about corals? Instead of the corals that we typically see today, there are a variety of different types of corals that existed in the Paleozoic. Two classes of those, or two groups of those corals, are known as tabulate corals, or colonial corals, and horn corals, or rugose corals. And we're going to be talking about both of those particular groups. Horn corals, hence the name horn coral, gets its name because of the structure. It looks more like a horn. So this is a solitary horn coral. This comes from the Ordovician rocks of Indiana. This is called Gruinkia canadense. This is a particular one polyp. So what you're looking at here is one polyp of that coral. And so the animal would have lived inside of that calcium carbonate skeleton. And so there are many different types of corals, or different types of horn corals, and this is just one of those particular species. Now, horn corals can also be solitary, just like the one that I just showed you. But they can also be colonial. We call those colonial rugose corals. One of the more famous colonial rugose corals that you may know of is one called Hexagonaria. Hexagonaria is a very well-known fossil found in Michigan, or found all over the different places of the world, but it makes a really good polished stone. When you polish it and you turn it into jewelry, it's commonly known as a Petoskey stone. So you may have recognized those stones being found in like jewelry shops or rock and mineral shows. That is actually colonial rugose coral. So here is another colonial rugose coral. You can actually see the individual holes here. Those are all polyps, all being connected together to form a group. And this is one that's called Hexagonaria. This is the rough portion. So this is what a Petoskey stone would look like before it is polished and turned into jewelry. This, however, is a Petoskey stone. As you can see here, you can see the individual diamond shape or octahedral type of polyps here. This is a Petoskey stone, a polished Petoskey stone from Michigan. And again, Hexagonaria is that particular genus of what a Petoskey stone is. So, fun fact of the day. So those are the different types of corals that we see in the Paleozoic. Horn corals and horn corals and colonial corals all go extinct by the end of the Permian period, somewhere between 252 million years ago. So what happens to those corals? Did we find coral reefs still in the fossil record after the extinction of the colonial and rugose corals? Yes, we do. Now, those corals are gone. The other corals that we find in the fossil record that still live on today are the Scleractinian corals. Those appeared in the Triassic period and are still the main corals that are the main coral reefs living today. So we see these types of corals in the beginning of the Triassic, and they're still living today. This one is from Pleistocene deposits in Florida, and as you can see, it's very different from the corals that we explored in the Paleozoic. Mostly being colonial. And here is a specimen replaced by quartz. This comes from the Miocene in from the Withlacoochee River down in Georgia and Florida. And this is known as the famous Withlacoochee coral and has often been replaced by silica. It's been replaced by quartz over periods of time, probably after it became a fossil. Corals are mostly composed of calcium carbonate. But over time, their skeletons can be replaced by minerals, and this is an example of a coral being replaced by quartz. So, Scleractinian corals are the most common reef-building organisms today. They're the most common corals, and they're only extant or still living species of corals or types of corals today. Now, during the Jurassic, those were kind of the common types of corals that we see. But in the Cretaceous, corals were not the main reef-building organisms. Instead, it was a bivalve known as a Rudist bivalve. And Rudists are actually clams or bivalves that existed at the very beginning of the Cretaceous and went extinct by the end of the Cretaceous period. Rudists are quite common fossils that you can typically find in Cretaceous deposits. And they're found a lot of different places. They're found in Texas, or they're found in North America. A lot of the highest deposits that we see of bivalves is actually in Jamaica, where we actually have Cretaceous deposits. And there is a wide variety and high diversity of bivalves within that particular region, or specifically rudists. And this is an example of a rudist bivalve. They can get very, very large. This is just a fragment of the Rudist bivalve. This is one that's called Durania, and it comes from the Utah Formation in the Cretaceous deposits in Mississippi. This is just a piece of that bivalve. And so that is typically what you'll see, is what you're looking at, or the fragment that I showed you, is what we call the horn section, or the left valve. The left valve is obviously going to be the biggest valve. And then you've got a much smaller valve, known as the operculum. It basically acts as like a door. So it shuts, it closes and shuts, and then it opens back up if the animal wanted to feed. And they fed on detritus matter. So here is a specimen of a bivalve, or of a rudist, from the Edwards Formation. And what you're looking at here is the intact, where you can see right here is the lid portion, or the operculum, and then the larger section is the left valve. And so it would open and close the right valve, and it would have connected the left valve into a group of other rudists. So these were group living organisms. These lived in an entire group together. And just to give you an example of how big some of these things would get, this is just a piece of rudist sections. So this entire rock here is composed of fragments of these bivalves that have been silicified, that have been replaced by quartz over time. This is known as the Edwardsville Reef, or a portion of this comes from the Edwardsville Formation. And all of these individual white specks here are composed of the broken up bits of this Rudist reef that used to exist in Texas during the earliest portion of the Cretaceous period. So again, as I said before, Rudists went extinct by the end of the Cretaceous, there are no more Rudist reefs living today, but they were the most common different types of reef-building organisms in the Cretaceous period. Now, those went extinct, but modern reef-building organisms like uh, bryozoans and like corals still exist today. Bryozoans were also reef-building organisms that still exist today. They also existed in the distant past, towards the Paleozoic. Common reef-building organisms like this are still living today. Now, corals are still living today, but they're under attack. There's a lot of like coral reef bleaching going on, and a lot of coral reefs are gone. Many of these coral reefs are still in danger, and so it is important that we look at reef building organisms in the past and we look at the modern organisms like coral reefs today, and we can learn about where reefs and how reefs have changed through the distant past.